So we're going to start with who wants to go first? I guess you can just kind of go off each other.
Okay.
Talking about your hometown, your roots, and what church you grew up in.
Okay. I grew up in rural Missouri on a farm.
Southeast.
And my mother died when I was 2 weeks old. And my dad and I lived with his parents. And he remarried when I was 2 years old. So by then, my grandparents, who were past 50, didn't want to give me up. So they kept me and raised me. And so basically, I was an only child through my growing up years. They belonged to a Pentecostal church, a Church of God of Prophecy. And for about the first 13 years of my life, my uncle, their son, was my pastor. It was a small country church and a small community, of course, but I went to the same school throughout my first 12 years. And by the time I graduated from high school, they were both 70. And so they were older in my teen years. But fortunately, since I was a part of the church, and that was pretty much what we did, was go to church and school in that community. So I didn't give them any problems. And when I learned to drive, we had a 49 Ford, and it was a bench seat. And my grandpa would sit in the middle, and of course we lived with, well, there were mostly just gravel roads. We didn't have paved roads in that area. And so when we would come to meeting a car the opposite direction, he'd take the steering wheel from me. But I learned to drive. And a cousin took me to the county courthouse to get my driver's license, and fortunately I passed and got my driver's license. When I graduated from high school, I had family in Kansas City, and so I went to Kansas City. And I had met Ron before I went there, and so we got engaged, and he was in college, and a year later we got married. And so that was, he completed his college degree at Kansas University.
Well, my history is with Kansas City, Missouri. We're always direct, it is Missouri. There is a Kansas City, Kansas, but we were on the larger side. I was born in 1936, a Depression kid. I went to a grade school that was very good, we thought. And they went through the 7th grade. The high school then that was nearby was called East High. It had 8 through 12, and that's what I did. By the time I got to 6th grade, though, I had decided to be an architect, and so when I got to the high school, I was very fortunate. We were required to take some shop classes in the 8th grade, and one of those alternatives was drafting. And so for 4 years of high school, I got to do drafting, and then went direct from there to the University of Kansas. University of Missouri did not have a school of architecture, so KU was my choice based on neighbor states that had one. I had other options, but went to the KU on a scholarship, and so that was the primary reason to show up there. It's one of those interesting degrees, by the way. Instead of 120 hours for a bachelor's, It was 163, so I had a 5-year program. And all kinds of labs, because you're drawing, you can't just draw one in an hour and go on. So they were all 3 hours. At any rate, I was in class a minimum of 32 hours every week, and one semester was in class 44 hours. So it was a little different going to school that way. But Hazel said she had met me. Actually, I lived in Kansas City, but my mother had come from over southeast Missouri also. We're not close to Hazel's location, but anyway, same church, Church of God of Prophecy, which was on Independence Avenue in Kansas City. So that's how we met. It was because she came to the city and went to church with my mother, and at any rate, that's how we started. But it was interesting.
Well, then how'd you get to the Methodist Church?
Well,
that was a long journey.
Yes, we attended, at some point or another, we attended regularly Presbyterian. We did not do much with Baptists.
None.
None, actually, that's true. But we went to several different ones, and I taught Sunday school in Presbyterian, and it was really kind of interesting. One year they asked me if I would be on their, I can't even remember now what the Board of Elders, I guess it was. And I said, sure, be glad to, but you have to be a member, don't you? We'd never joined. In fact, I went to seminary and had never joined any church until I got in seminary.
Well, and that was it. We had lived in this town in Moberly, Missouri for 10 years while he was an architect, and we had 3 children. And so he felt the call to ministry, and so we visited Phillips Graduate Seminary in Enid, Oklahoma. Our youngest son was in kindergarten or first grade at this point, wasn't he?
Yeah.
When Ron decided to change careers. And so we moved from Moberly, Missouri to Enid, Oklahoma, and in the summer, Ron had already moved out there to begin their spring semester?
No, actually, I moved out there first to get a job, to be able to work and go to school, no scholarship, and to find a place to live. The town was an Air Force base and a big oil town, and so properties were either too expensive to rent or so terrible that I wouldn't put the family in them. So I managed to find a house about 5 or 6 blocks from the seminary that was for sale, and at the horrible price of $10,000, which
and it had a basement apartment we could rent.
And we could rent it out, and did, to another seminarian, and it was a good, interesting
and
town.
It was equal distance to the grade school where our youngest son attended, and the middle school where our 2 older children attended. They could walk to that school.
Yeah.
And we only had 1 vehicle, which meant Hazel had to work. And so I was able to find work, and so Ron was able to work and go to school. But that first summer that we moved the family out there, he was crazy enough to take Greek.
Well, I really figured if I take it in the summer, I got no other class to compete with it. And so I could do that. It wasn't required, neither Greek nor Hebrew. At one time they did, but it wasn't by that time. But I thought that would be helpful.
And this was a Disciples of Christ seminary,
Yeah,
graduate seminary.
another church.
And Dr. Fred Craddock was his professor of New Testament while
And
he was
preaching.
there. And so he's, of course, well known, as you probably are familiar with his writings. And so he was fortunate to have his.
But it was
tutelage.
about 2 blocks around the corner where the, at that point in time, 1970s when we moved there. So the United Methodist Church was 2 years old. But at any rate, that pastor was excellent, and we joined the church there. After all those years, I had never joined. But at any rate, and they accepted my baptism. I did get baptized along the way, but it was a whole different experience.
And, of course, when he graduated in 3 years.
Yeah.
And so at that point, he had, of course, learned about the district superintendent that lived there, and he offered him a church there in Oklahoma.
Bartlesville.
Then we decided we wanted to check out Arkansas, even though we were born and raised Missourians, and that's where our children were born and raised until we left to go to Oklahoma. And for whatever reason, we decided to come to Arkansas. So we contacted the bishop over here, and he arranged for us to make 2 visits that Saturday that we came. One was to the Central Church in Fayetteville. There was an associate position opening, and the other one was down Bauxite, or?
No, I'm just blank
But it
on
was in the Little Rock Conference. At that point, there were 2 conferences, the North Arkansas and the Little Rock Conference, and so we visited a church in each conference. And after visiting with Dr. Cooper in Fayetteville, who was the senior pastor, Chris' dad was that pastor then, and so we decided to go to Fayetteville. So we moved to Arkansas with our family.
Well, there was a slight tie. My mother was born up east of at Gamaliel. It's a little town that half of it's under the lake up there now. But Mountain Home was the big town nearby.
Oh, okay.
And so I have relatives in that area. In fact, Baxter County, my middle name's Baxter, one of my mother's family tree is Baxter's. So that's how all that worked out. But we had vacationed a lot here.
In Arkansas.
Yeah. But we kind of enjoyed the possibility. It was kind of intriguing because the Board of Ordained Ministry here, when I was interviewed for it, to get my elders, I actually got
your deacon orders.
Yeah, I got deacon order in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and that was by a bishop who was one of the last ones out of the old United Brethren. And so then when I got ordained elder here, and so I've got it lined back both ways.
But he was ordained deacon at Boston Avenue, United Methodist in Tulsa. So that was significant that he was ordained there.
It was also interesting, the year I was up for elder, there was only one other candidate. And that's, in our opinion, that's still the best class that they've ever had, but that's, Phil Hathcock and me, 2 people. So
Phil's a good guy.
Phil had been an associate of some sort at Boston Avenue at one point. But it's been a good, and my sister-in-law, my brother's wife, said, "You sure know how to pick them, don't you?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Well, 163 hours for a bachelor's and 90 hours for a deacon. For a master's, so 90 hours."
And then he went on to get his doctorate of ministry, and by that point we had 2 older children who were in college, so we had 3 college students.
Actually, when I got my D-Min bestowed on me, we hurried back from that to be at our
Brian.
son's Hendricks graduation. So it's interesting.
But then I took a different route. Do you want me to talk about that?
Oh, yeah, please.
Okay. When our youngest son graduated high school, I had felt the call when I was a teenager, but then had gotten married and had children, and so I began the process of a local pastor. And so I didn't go the ordination route, but I was a local pastor and went to the course of study, and I was an associate at Sequoia United Methodist in Fayetteville. And then when Ron moved from Springdale, he was an associate at Springdale First Church. And so when he got orders to go to Horseshoe Bend, I didn't have an appointment. I chose not to. But while we were there, I was asked to be an interim pastor at Calico Rock. So I went to Calico Rock and was pastor. And they wanted me to stay, but I didn't feel that was where I needed to be. And so at conference, I still didn't have an appointment. And while we were at conference, the pastor of First Church Jacksonville, our district superintendent told me that Greg wanted to talk to me. And so we visited, and he asked me to go on as his associate out at First Church Jacksonville. And so I did that, and I was out there at Jacksonville until I retired. And then when I retired, I was asked to be an interim pastor up at Carlisle. And so I went out there, and then later I was asked to be an interim at Geyer Springs United Methodist. And then after Ron retired from Keogh, we did an associate interim up at Harrison. And oddly enough, we went back to the same charge that he had had when he left Fayetteville Central. And so we had those 3 small churches we served together.
Well, directly, but it was an 8-church enlarged charge. But there were 8 churches altogether. I had 2 local pastor associates. One handled 3 and one handled 2, and I handled 3. And we would meet regularly and talk about it. But she was also associate at Lakewood, or just
my first
4 blocks that
appointment.
way.
My first appointment was a unique situation. I was out at Austin and Old Austin, and each of those churches were in a separate conference. One was in the Little Rock Conference, and the other one was in the North Arkansas Conference, which meant I had 2 district superintendents. Yes. It was the only church in the whole state that was like that, so that was very unique. And of course, neither church had a woman pastor, but they were very accepting of me. In fact, one of the older gentlemen, when I left that church, in fact, I came to Lakewood as an associate from out there. And this man followed me out the car, and he said, "I want you to promise you'll come back and do my funeral." I thought that was the height of a compliment. But anyway, I came to Lakewood as an associate. And that wasn't the last time I went there. After I had retired and done these other interim, Richard Lancaster was pastor up here. And he asked me to come on staff as older adult ministry. They didn't have an older adult ministry going on then. And so I went there, and I was there for 2 years developing that ministry. And so that was my last appointment that I've had, and I've been retired ever since. So, yeah. But like I said, I was not ordained. I was a local pastor, full-time local pastor, until I did the, short-term interim pastorate. So, and I'm not saying that to be proud, but that was the path that the Methodist Church allowed me. And of course, we have many local pastors in our church, and you do a prescribed course of study. And so that was the path I took.
Not mentioned in all this, I was actually in the conference offices for 8 years. When I left the church at Manila, I came down to the conference office as the associate director and served in that job for 6 years, and then was the director of cooperative parish ministry and new church development for 3 years. So that was 9 years actually at headquarters there at First Church, Little Rock, up there in the other in fact, the classroom that we attend there is back in the corner on the northeast side. That was where the treasurer's office was, and for my first year as the cooperative parish person, I was in that same office space, and then moved down into what's now another classroom and had a different office.
Were they divided into cubicles or
office spaces?
In the finance space, yes, but later it was by room. Everybody could lock their own space, which was meaningful, especially when you're talking about financial records and so on. But and there were 2 offices. One for the Little Rock Conference was at the northwest corner when you came off the floor there, where the neighbor, the office now where I'm trying to think of her title, but anyway, Haley is there where the
District
Community Ministries, that's what it was, the district superintendent's office for the Little Rock Conference, Little Rock District. And then the North Arkansas was, you go in the door and you go one way. Ours was on the right, North Arkansas. So it worked out pretty well. Good use of space. We were glad they had built that building. Made it handy for everybody. But things have changed a lot, after, I guess it was...
Well, you left in 89.
I left there in 88 and then came... the time we moved back, shortly after that was when we became one conference. So all my primary ministry as a pastor as such was in North Arkansas. Yeah.
I guess going back to early on in your lives, was there a group of people or an individual that really stood out as an inspiration for you that led you into your call to ministry?
I guess I would have to say my grandparents, but especially my uncle, who was my pastor for those formative years. And I think that perhaps was where I would say my inspiration came from.
I didn't really have a mentor as such. I was actually at a crossroads. I knew I really didn't feel like I belonged in an architect's office anymore, that something else was needing to be happening. And so I checked several things, teaching and moving to another place and all those. And finally, a pastor said to me one time, did you ever think you were being called to the ministry? And I thought, no, I really didn't. But then I thought later, yeah. So that was the process. And in terms of where I went to seminary, there was a pastor at the prison south of town who helped me decide about where to go. His sister taught at Phillips University, which is where the Phillips Graduate Seminary was. And that's what led me to go to that school. But actually in school, it was Fred Craddock and a professor, Glenn Rose, who was Old Testament professor, who did archaeological work in Israel every summer. And also there was Howard Huff was a fellow who was ecumenical. He had spent years as a missionary in Japan and on the staff of pastors and leaders at the United Nations building. And I visited with, he was my actual counselor in seminary, and that was good. That helped.
And they took a tour group over to Israel. Was that every year or every other year?
No, about every 3 or 4 years.
And so while Ron was in seminary, we went on one of those tours to Israel and Greece.
With Craddock and Rose as the leaders.
And he was able to take a class as a part of that trip. They would have lectures or in the evening, and so then at the end of the trip, when he went back to seminary, he had to write a paper, I guess. Wasn't that a part of it? And so he did that, but we had that experience while he was in seminary, which was wonderful, and his mother was able to come and stay with our 3 children while we did that.
That's one of those side things that made seminary interesting. And,
Have 3 children go to seminary.
Yeah.
I'll never forget that we took this trip to Enid because we'd never been there, and we left our 3 children with a next door neighbor who was our sitter when we needed someone to stay with them. Of course, we paid her. And so she stayed with our children, and our youngest son got the chicken pox while we're gone. Fortunately, it was manageable. But I remember when we were there and he had visited with the professors and the dean of the school, and we were thinking about housing and all that was involved with moving, and him working and me working, because I'd been a stay-at-home mom. And I remembered, and I could take you to the place where I didn't say it out loud, but I said to God, why do we have to make this move? We have 3 children, and we tithe, and we're active in the church, and I'll never forget, the Holy Spirit said, anyone who comes after me must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me daily. I never complained to Ron that I didn't want to do this, but I knew that God was calling us to a new dimension or walk in our faith journey, and that was what we had to do. So that's what we did.
The other side of that, which has always been interesting to me, and I know everything's so much more expensive nowadays, but we did 3 years of seminary. I did not work full time. I got in at most about 30 hours a week, and Hazel worked a part-time job also. We got no scholarship money of any kind. I graduated in 3 years, which is the minimum. I didn't have to take 4, 5, or 6 like some of them, my friends did, or a lot of them nowadays have to take longer. But we got out of school and we moved to Arkansas debt-free.
And
I'll take it back. We had to pay the expense for that trip to Israel. So we owed a total for both of us altogether $1,500.
But fortunately, unlike a lot of seminarians, they had pastorates 100 miles away, and so they had to come in during the week or whenever their classes were. And Ron was able to pastor a little community church that was, 7 miles from where we lived?
Maybe not that far.
And it was non-denominational, which, like he said, at that point we had not joined the United Methodist Church. So he was able to pastor this little church that met every Sunday. And it had a wonderful community of believers. And so it was just a great transition for us. And then when we joined the United Methodist Church, but that point he was completing his seminary work, and so that worked well for us.
That little church always out here, Scott, is interdenominational. That's what that one was. We kept the books, and if they joined as a Roman Catholic, then when they left and transferred out, they transferred out.
And we didn't rebaptize?
We didn't rebaptize. We baptized all 3 ways. I mean, it was, in fact, some of our members out there got banned from one church because we did sprinkle at their church. So...
it was a good experience, and there was a wonderful architectural firm there at Enid.
Yes.
And that was where Ron was able to work. They told him you can work your own hours. He had a key. You can come anytime you want. And so, in fact, he designed, was a Disciples of Christ church for one of the seminarians while he was there.
Yeah, and a newspaper office.
So, it was a good situation. I'd say it was a God event. So.
Enid was a good move.
Yeah, right.
It really was.
It was a wonderful town, but we'd never lived outside of Missouri. And we moved to Oklahoma, and there were days when the sky would be red, and it was the dust, and it's red dirt, but it's a rich soil. When I was growing up, red dirt was clay, and nothing would grow in clay. But there, of course, you grow wheat and all of these wonderful crops, and the sky was red because it would just, it was windy. And I said, I love the town and the people, but I could not get used to that wind. It was
where
beyond.
The wind comes sweeping over the plain.
It was something else. But anyway, we had a good experience, and our children did well in school and thrived. And so, yeah, it was good. God knew what he was doing after all. I didn't have to tell him again.
Was there any point when that faith was challenged?
I guess that one point, maybe that would be the only.
I really can't recall any. There were times of disappointments, but everybody has those. Mm-hmm. Not outside of routine. Growing up and family and so on. It was just this the way it was. And
Well, he didn't always get the best appointment after.
Well, I figured one of the things that when we joined the United Methodist Church that I was looking at was, number one, their belief system was near where I was. I accepted everybody. If they're a Christian, they're a Christian. We might disagree on how we do things, but that was one of Wesley's statements: if your heart is as my heart, then, come on. Secondly was that it would not be up to me to go find a church or prove to a church that I could be a pastor or, be responsible to get the employment. I went through that as an architect twice, which was also interesting. But the ecumenical thing, when I went from Fayetteville to Harrison, I was elected the ecumenical person for our conference. And so I was involved in all the different meetings with an ecumenical group. And when I was at the council office, same thing. I had that job with ecumenical and also with what they call a legislative reconnaissance, or anyway, putting out information about what was going on at the Capitol. And it was ecumenical. So
you'd have a real good time.
It was a whole lot.
This legislature.
I didn't have to take big stances and fight, and I wouldn't do it. Just wouldn't have done it anyway. But that made it very, very helpful to me to be able to continue to be a Christian, what I called it. United Methodist variety, but open. And I always thought that was where we all ought to be. Really did, still do. Church-wise especially, but as people. In fact, one of my best appointments, I was full-time at the conference office, but I was the pastor for McCabe Chapel, UMC, which was a black church.
Well, that was just an interim, though.
It was for a year, but it was I was the pastor, and we had a good year, and I thoroughly enjoyed and felt like they enjoyed having me. So, called her the First Lady.
First and only time.
And the other thing, I had told other pastors, that was the only congregation I ever served where the chair of the board would come and sit down at the meeting with a glass of water, a gavel, a Bible, and the discipline. No other church that I served ever had that kind of a chair of the board.
And was it a weekly report of the giving by the name?
Well, they did things that were interesting.
First church take lesson.
The bulletin every Sunday, on the back of the bulletin was a list of the giving the previous Sunday. Not this is how much we got, but this is what so-and-so gave, this is what so-and-so gave. Yeah.
Now, I don't advocate for that.
No, but one thing about it, they were open with each other. They all knew what was going on.
There were no secrets.
Exactly.
No secrets, absolutely none. In fact, one of the first couple of Sundays, I guess, that we were there, I said something to this same chairman as we were going out. I said, well, I'm sorry, it looked like it's about 10 after 12, and I'm, a little late maybe to get out. And he looked at me and he said, Pastor, don't worry about it. No matter what time we get out, we're probably going to be out here talking in the parking lot till 1 o'clock or 1:30 anyway. So, that's who we are, and we are family, and it was a good experience for me. Very good. thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, what feelings, emotions, experiences have you had during the pandemic?
Oh dear.
I don't know. It's just a different world than I grew up in and that I would prefer.
Well, and I think
having.
the church is going to suffer irreparable damage because of this separation that we've had. We've not been connected. And so it's going to take, and I'm sure your mother knows much more about this than I do, but it seems to me that this interlude that we've had these past 2 years is going to cause people to not need the church. They're not going to go back. And so the church is going to have an uphill climb as to how they can to regain this ground that we've lost. I just feel that it's easy to sit here and watch that service on TV.
Mm-hmm. Convenient.
Uh-huh. I don't need to get up and get dressed. I can sit here with my coffee and my robe if I want to. And I don't have to go to that church. And I can send in my money if I want to and if I don't want to.
Which we do.
Yeah, we do. But I'm telling you, when you don't do the same habit or the same ritual, then it becomes commonplace and you get used to it. And of course, we're past 80. But the younger folks, I'm guessing, have gotten in this same apathetic routine that they can just, okay, I don't need that church. I can do it at home.
The whole, we will go back to church. But it's still going to be different. We may be faced with this virus
For the rest of our
for
life.
far too many years yet, because it's going to mutate, it's going to change. She was talking about the giving. During this time, I have absolutely no idea what most churches are able to do and have been doing. But I know from being there and hearing stories about the Depression from my folks, and then studying the history and seeing studies that were made, the Depression days in the United States, people in churches as a whole gave a higher percentage of income than they ever did before or have ever since. That was a time to confront the way the life was moving, and they didn't want to, but they gave to the church. I've had ingrained in me that tithing that's just what you do, and we still do. It's just, and then we had a bishop one time who said in annual conference, in a meeting where he was addressing the whole conference, that he tithes. A part of it would go to the missions field, and part of it would go to some local thing. And my whole upbringing has been, you tithe and then you do those things. And so during this time, I don't know how that's really going to finally be affected, because I hardly ever hear teaching about tithing anywhere.
We didn't grow up hearing much about
Tithing.
Yeah.
On the other hand, our daughter and son-in-law, they are Baptist, and we don't hold that against them. You wouldn't find a better Christian anywhere. I mean, our daughter and son-in-law, well, he's a deacon in their church. They are there Sunday morning. Well, they don't have Sunday night service, but they have Wednesday night. She has been their choir director. She has taught VBS, and she teaches children Sunday morning, and Wednesday night she has a whole program. And she is not a paid staff, but she has done there. She was an art teacher, and so VBS, you would not believe what she does to decorate and get ready for VBS. But they opened up before we have here. They live in Jesseville, and so they have a small community. But at first they started with the pastor having a speaker outside, and she would go and lead the music. People would drive up in their vehicles and sit in their vehicle. Kind of like a drive-in. Yeah, church drive-in. But then they finally opened up and they had distant seating because they have chairs in their sanctuary instead of pews, so they could move them around.
Move them into groups.
But what they started doing when they were doing the outside services, the deacons would stand with a plate for people to put their money in, and that's the way they would collect. And of course, people could mail it in. But when they started indoor services, they had these plates in the vestibule, and the people could leave their offering there. Would you guess they had more people giving during this time than when they actually passed the plate? And so they said it wasn't just their church, but they've learned their other Baptist churches have had that same experience, that people have been more giving. Of course, we never know what our church gives or how many people attend because we never see those numbers. But they have had a better response to just dropping it in this plate as they leave. Who would have thought? I would not have. And I know for a while, First Church did that also. But that they started the passing the offering plates again. But I thought that was interesting that they felt that that was a success and that they will continue to do that. But anyway, that's a good thing that's come out of it.
No, it is, yeah. It's surprising.
Yeah, it is. Very surprising.
Well, where do you see the church in 10 years? The dreaded question.
Well, God is still God, and God is able to do whatever God wants to do, but there have to be people that are willing to do what God wants them to do. And
you just go by the scripture. The church is established and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So we will have a church. There will be a church. How many? How many denominations? It's scary to me. When I was in seminary, and that was 73, so that's 50 years ago, I bought a book because I was interested in interfaith things. And it listed all the denominations in the U.S. There were 2,500 denominations in the U.S. The last time I looked for that book, it has been put out about every 10 years. The last one I saw was there are 3,700 denominations now. And there may be 4,000 or 5,000 there, but the church that's faithful will be there. One of the realities, even before all of this pandemic and all of the rise in hate, I studied years and years ago about churches and church locations, and surveys were made, and it was discovered that the majority of people, regardless of denomination, would drive by as many as 3 or 4 churches of their own denomination on their way to the one they wanted to attend. So it was not necessarily particular belief, but where they felt at home, where they were received, where they could be heard, and where not only had a voice, but they could learn and be growing in their faith. And if that can go on in the face of everything else, I'm hopeful for everything, for the society.
Well, that's a good, hopeful note to end on.
Okay.